Chapters 1 through 3. For 2 years, Alan Green had lived without hope. From the day the spaceship had crashed on this unknown planet, he had resigned himself to the destiny created for him by accident and mathematics. Chances against another ship landing within the next 100 years were 1,000,000 to 1. Therefore, it would do no good to sit around waiting for rescue. Much as he loathed the idea, he must live the rest of his life here, and he must squeeze as much blood as he could out of this planet-sized turnip. There wasn't much to squeeze. In fact, it seemed to him that he was the one losing the blood. Shortly after he'd been cast away, he'd been made a slave. Now, suddenly, he had hope. Hope came to him a month after he'd been made foreman of the kitchen slaves of the Duke of Tropat. It came to him as he was standing behind the Duchess during a meal and directing those who were waiting upon her. It was the Duchess Zuni who had not so subtly maneuvered him from the labor pens to his coveted, if dangerous, position. Why dangerous? Because she was very jealous and possessive, and the slightest hint of lack of attention from him could mean he'd lose his life or one limb or another. The knowledge of what had happened to his 2 predecessors kept him extremely sensitive to her every gesture, her every wish. That fateful morning he was standing behind her as she sat at one end of the long breakfast table. In one hand he held his foreman's wand, a little white baton topped by a large red ball. With it he gestured at the slaves who served food, who poured wine and beer, who fanned away the flies, who carried in the household god and sat it on the god chair, who played something like music. Now and then he bent over the Duchess Zuni's long black hair and whispered phrases from this or that love poem, praising her beauty, her supposed unattainability, and his burning, if seemingly hopeless, passion for her. Zuni would smile, or repeat the formula of thanks, the short one, or else giggle at his funny accent. The Duke sat at the other end of the table. He ignored the byplay, just as he ignored the so-called secret passage inside the walls of the castle, which Green used to get to the Duchess's apartments. Custom demanded this, just as custom demanded that he should play the outraged husband if she got tired of Green, or angry at him and accused him publicly of amorous advances. This was enough to make Green jittery, but he had more than the Duke to consider. There was Alzo. Alzo was the Duchess's watchdog, a mastiff-like monster with shaggy red-gold hair. The dog hated Green with a vindictiveness that Green could only account for by supposing that the animal knew, perhaps from his body odor, that he was not a native of this planet. Alzo rumbled a warning deep in his chest every time Green bent over the Duchess or made a too sudden movement. Occasionally he rose to his 4 feet and nuzzled the man's leg. When that happened, Green could not keep from breaking out into a sweat, for the dog had twice bitten him, playfully so to speak, and severely lacerated his calf. As if that weren't bad enough, Green had to worry that the natives might notice that his scars healed abnormally fast, almost overnight. He'd been forced to wear bandages on his legs long after the new skin had come in. Even now the nauseating canine was sniffing around Green's quivering hide in the hope of putting the fear of the devil in him. At that moment the Earthman resolved that, come the headsman's axe, rack, wheel, or other hellish tortures, he was going to kill that hound. It was just after he made that vow that the Duchess caused him to forget altogether the beast. "Dear," said Zuni, interrupting the Duke in the midst of his conversation with a merchant captain, "what is this I hear about 2 men who have fallen from the sky in a great ship of iron?" Green quivered, and he held his breath as he waited for the Duke's reply. The Duke, a short, dark, many-chinned man with white hair and very thick, bristly, salt-and-pepper eyebrows, frowned. "Men? Demons, rather. Can men fly in an iron ship through the air? These 2 claim to have come from the stars, and you know what that means."
Remember Oixrato's prophecy. A demon will come, claiming to be an angel. No doubt about these two. Just to show you their subtlety, they claim to be neither demon nor angels, but men. Now, there's devilish clever thinking. Confusing to anybody but the most clear-headed. I'm glad the King of Astoria wasn't taken in.
Eagerly Zuni leaned forward, her large brown eyes bright, her red-painted mouth open and wet. "Oh, has he burned them already? What a shame! I should think he'd at least torture them for a while." Moran, the merchant captain, said, "Your pardon, gracious lady, but the King of Astoria has done no such thing. The Astorian law demands that all suspected demons should be kept in prison for 2 years. Everybody knows that a devil can't keep his human disguise for more than 2 years. At the end of that time he reverts to his natural mesh and form. A hideous sight to behold, blasphemous, repulsive, soul-shaking." Moran rolled his one good eye so that only the white showed, and made the sign to ward off evil, the index finger held rigidly out from a clenched fist. Jug Caxter, the household priest, dived under the table, where he crouched praying, secure in the knowledge that demons couldn't touch him while he knelt beneath the thrice-blessed wood. The Duke swallowed a whole glass of wine, apparently to calm his nerves, and belched. Moran wiped his face and said, "Of course, I wasn't able to find out much, because we merchants are regarded with deep suspicion and scarcely dare to move outside the harbor or the marketplace. The Astorians worship a female deity. Ridiculous, isn't it? And eat fish. They hate us Tropatians because we worship Zaxropater, male of males, and because they must depend on us to bring them fish. But they aren't closed-mouthed. They babble on and on to us, especially when one has given them wine for nothing." Green finally released his breath in a sigh of relief. How glad he was that he had never told these people his true origin. So far as they knew, he was merely one of the many slaves who came from a distant country in the north. Moran cleared his throat, adjusted his violet turban and yellow robes, pulled gently at the large gold ring that hung from his nose, and said, "It took me a month to get back from Astoria, and that is very good time indeed. But then I am noted for my good luck, though I prefer to call it skill, plus the favor given by the gods to the truly devout. I do not boast, O gods, but merely give you tribute because you have smiled upon my ventures and have found pleasing the scent of my many sacrifices in your nostrils." Green lowered his eyelids to conceal his expression of disgust, which he felt must be shining from them. At the same time, he saw Zuni's shoe tapping impatiently. Inwardly he groaned, because he knew she would divert the conversation to something more interesting to her clothes, and the state of her stomach and or complexion, and there would be nothing that anybody could do about it, because the custom was that the woman of the house regulated the subject of talk during breakfast. If only this had been lunch or dinner, then the men would have, theoretically, have had uncontested control. "These 2 demons were very tall, like your slave Green here," said Moran, "and they could not speak a word of Astorian, or at least they claimed they couldn't. When King Rosmig's soldiers tried to capture them, they brought from the folds of their strange clothes 2 pistols that only had to be pointed to send silent and awesome and sure death. Everywhere men dropped dead. Panic overtook many, but there were brave soldiers who kept on charging, and eventually the magical instruments became exhausted. The demons were overpowered and put into the Tower of Grass Cats, from which no man or demon has yet escaped. And there they will be until the Festival of the Sun's Eye. Then they will be burnt." From beneath the table rose the babble of the priest, Jug Caxter, as he blessed everyone in the house, down to the latest-born pup, and the fleas living thereof, and cursed all those who were possessed by even the tiniest demon. The Duke, growing impatient at the noise, kicked under the table. Jug Caxter yelped and presently crawled out. He sat down and began gnawing the meat from a bone, a "well done, thou good and faithful servant" expression on his fat features. Green also felt like kicking him, just as he often felt like kicking every single human being on this planet. It was hard to remember that he must exercise compassion and understanding for them, and that his own remote ancestors had once been just as nauseatingly superstitious, cruel, and bloody. There was a big difference between reading about such people and actually living among them. A history or romantic novel could describe how unwashed and diseased and formula-bound primitives were, but only the too substantial stench and filth could make your gorge rise. Even as he stood there, Zuni's powerful perfume rose and clung in heavy festoons about him, and slithered down his nostrils. It was a rare and expensive perfume, brought back by Moran from his voyages, and given to her as a token of the merchant's esteem. Used in small quantities, it would have been quite effective to express feminine daintiness and to hint at delicate passion. But no, Zuni poured it like water over her, hoping to cover up the stale odor left by not taking a bath more than once a month. She looked so beautiful, he thought, and stank so terribly. At least she had at first. Now she looked less beautiful because he knew how stupid she was, and didn't stink quite so badly because his nostrils had become somewhat adjusted. They'd had to. "I intend to be back in Astoria by the time of the festival," said Moran. "I have never seen the Eye of the Sun burn demons before. It's a giant lens, you know. There will be just time enough to make a voyage there and get back before the rainy season. I expect to make even greater profits than the last time, because I've established some highly placed contacts. O gods, I do not boast, but merely praise your favor to your humble worshipper, Moran, the merchant of the clan of the Ethanican." "Please bring me some more of this perfume," said the Duchess. "And I just love the diamond necklace you gave me." "Diamonds, emeralds, rubies," cried Moran, kissing his hand and rolling his eye ecstatically. "I tell you, the Astorians are rich beyond our dreams. Jewels flow in their marketplace like drops of water in a cataract. Ah, if only the Emperor could be induced to organize a great raiding fleet and storm its walls."
"He remembers too well what happened to his father's fleet when he tried it," growled the Duke. "The storm that destroyed his 30 ships was undoubtedly raised by the priests of the goddess Huda. I still think that the expedition would have succeeded, however, if the late Emperor had not ignored the vision that came to him the night before they set sail. It was the great god Axoputqui, and he said—"
There was a lengthy conversation which did not hold Green's attention. He was too busy trying to think of a plan whereby he could get to Astoria and to the demon's iron vessel, which was obviously a spaceship. This was his only chance. Soon the rainy season would start, and there would be no vessels leaving for at least 3 months. He could, of course, just walk away and hope to get to Astoria on foot. Thousands of miles through countless perils, and he had only a general idea of where the city was. No, Moran was his only hope. But how? He didn't think that stowing away would work. There was always a careful search for slaves who might try just that very plan. He looked at Moran, the short, fat, big-stomached, hook-nosed, one-eyed fellow with many chins and a large gold ring in his nose. The fellow was shrewd, and he would not want to offend the Duchess by helping her official gigolo escape. Not, that is, unless Green could offer him something that was so valuable that he couldn't afford not to take the risk. Moran boasted that he was a hard-headed businessman, but it was Green's observation that there was always a large soft spot in that supposedly impenetrable cranium, the fissure of Cupiditas. The Duke rose, and everybody followed his example. Jug Caxter chanted the formula of dismissal, then sat down to finish gnawing on the bone. The others filed out. Green walked in front of Zuni in order to warn her of any obstacles in her path, and to take the brunt of any attempted assassination. As he did so, he was seized by the ankle and tripped headlong. He did not fall hard, because he was a quick man, in spite of his 6'2" and 190 pounds, but he rose red-faced because of the loud laughter and from repressed anger at Alzo, who had again repeated his trick of grabbing Green's leg and upsetting him. He wanted to grab a spear from a nearby guard and spit Alzo, but that would be the end of Green. And whereas up to now there had been many times when he would not particularly have cared if he left this planet via the death route, he could not now make a false move, not when escape was so near. So he grinned sheepishly and again preceded the Duchess, while the others followed her out. When they reached the bottom of the broad stone staircase that led to the upper floors of the castle, Zuni told Green that he was to go to the marketplace and buy tomorrow's food. As for her, she was going back to bed and sleep until noon. Inwardly, Green groaned. How long could he keep up this pace? He was expected to stay up half the night with her, then attend to his official duties during the day. She slept enough to be refreshed by the time he visited her, but he never had a chance for any real rest. Even when he had his free hours in the afternoon, he had to go to his house in the Pens, and there he had to stay awake and attend to all his familial duties. And Amra, his slave wife, and her 6 children demanded much from him. They were even more tyrannical than the Duchess, if that were possible. How long, oh Lord, how long? The situation was intolerable. Even if he'd not heard of the spaceship, he would have plotted to escape. Better a quick death while trying to get away than a slow, torturous one by exhaustion. He bowed goodbye to the Duke and Duchess, then followed the violet turban and yellow robes of Moran through the courtyard, through the thick stone walls, over the bridge of the broad moat, and into the narrow winding streets of the city of Quats. Here the merchant captain got into his silver and jewel-decorated rickshaw. The 2 long-legged men between its shafts, sailors and clansmen from Moran's vessel, the Bird of Fortune, began running through the crowd. The people made way for them, as 2 other sailors preceded them, calling out Moran's name and cracking whips in the air. Green, after looking to make certain that nobody from the castle was around to see him, ran until he was even with the rickshaw. Moran halted it and asked what he wanted. "Your pardon, your richness, but may a humble slave speak and not be reprimanded?" "I presume it's no idle thought you have in mind," said Moran, looking Green over, his one eye narrow in its fat folds. "It has to do with money." "Ah, despite your foreign accent you speak with a pleasing voice. You are the golden trumpet of Menerox, my patron god. Speak." "First, your richness must swear by Menerox that you will under no circumstances divulge my proposal." "There is wealth in this, for me?" "There is." Moran glanced at his clansmen, standing there patiently, apparently oblivious of what was going on. He had the power of life and death over them, but he didn't trust them. He said, "Perhaps it would be better if I thought about this before making such a drastic oath. Could you meet me tonight at the hour of the wine-glass at the House of Equality? And could you perhaps give me a slight hint of what you have in mind?" The answer to both is yes. My proposal has to do with the dried fish that you carry as cargo to the Astorians. There is another thing, too, but I may not even hint at it until I have your oath. "Very well, then. At the agreed hour. Fish, eh? I must be off. Time is money, you know. Get going, boys. Full sails." Green hailed a passing rickshaw and seated himself comfortably in it. As assistant major domo, he had plenty of money. Moreover, the Duke and Duchess would have been outraged if he had lowered their prestige by walking through the city's streets. His vehicle made good time, too, because everybody recognized his livery, the scarlet and white tricorn hat, and the white sleeveless shirt with the Duke's heraldic arms on its chest, red and green concentric circles, pierced by a black arrow. The street led always downward, for the city had been built on the foothills of the mountains. It wandered here and there, giving Green plenty of time to think. The trouble was, he thought, that if the two imprisoned men at Astoria were to die before he got to them, he'd still be lost. He had no idea how to pilot or navigate a spaceship. He'd been a passenger on a freighter when it had unaccountably blown up, and he'd been forced to leave the dying vessel in one of those automatic castaway emergency shells. The capsule had got him down to the surface of this planet, and was, as far as he knew, still up in the hills where he'd left it. After wandering for a week and almost starving to death, he'd been picked up by some peasants. They had turned him in to the soldiers of a nearby garrison, thinking he must be a runaway slave on whom they'd collect a reward. Taken to the capital city of Quats, Green had almost been freed, because there was no record of his being anybody's property. But his tallness, blondness, and inability to speak the local language had convinced his captors that he must have wandered down from some far northern country. Therefore, if he wasn't a slave, he should be. Presto changeo, he was. And he'd put in 6 months in a quarry and a year as a dock worker. Then the Duchess had chanced to see him on the streets as she rode by, and he'd been transferred to the castle. The streets were alive with the short, dark, stocky natives and the taller, lighter-complexioned slaves. The former wore their turbans of various colors, indicating their status and trade. The latter wore their three-cornered hats. Occasionally, a priest in his high conical hat, hexagonal spectacles, and goatee rode by. Wagons and rickshaws drawn by men or by big powerful dogs went by. Merchants stood at the fronts of their shops and hawked their wares in loud voices. They sold cloth, grixter nut, parchment, knives, swords, helmets, drugs, books on magic, on religion, on travel, spices, perfumes, ink, rugs, highly sugared drinks, wine, beer, tonic, paintings, everything that went to make up their civilization. Butchers stood before open shops where dressed fowl, deer, and dogs hung. Dealers in birds pointed out the virtues of their many-colored and multi-songed pets. For the 1000th time, Green wondered at this strange planet where the only large animals were men, dogs, grass cats, a small deer, and a very small equine. In fact, there was a paucity of any variety of animal life, except for the surprisingly large number of birds. It was this scarcity of horses and oxen, he supposed, that helped perpetuate slavery. Man and dog had to provide most of the labor. No doubt there was an explanation for all this, but it must be buried so deep in this people's forgotten history that one would never know. Green, always curious, wished he had the time and means to explore. But he didn't. He might as well resign himself to keeping a whole skin and to getting out of this mess as fast as he could. There was enough to do merely to make his way through the narrow and crowded streets. He had to display his baton often to clear a path, though when he approached the harbor area he had less trouble because the streets were much wider. Here great wagons drawn by gangs of slaves carried huge loads to or from the ships. The thoroughfares had to be broad, else the people would have been crushed between wagon and house. Here also were the so-called pens, where the dock slaves lived. Once the area had actually been an enclosure where men and women were locked up for the night, but the walls had been torn down and new houses built in the old Duke's time. The closest earthly parallel Green could think of for these edifices was a housing project. Small cottages, all exactly alike, set in military columns. For a moment he considered stopping off to see Amra, then decided against it. She'd get him tied up in an argument or something, and he'd spend too much time trying to soothe her, time that should be spent at the marketplace. He hated scenes, whereas Amra was a born self-dramatist who reveled in them, almost wallowed, one might say. He averted his eyes from the pens and looked at the other side of the street, where the walls of the great warehouses towered. Workmen swarmed around them, and cranes, operated by gangs pushing wheels like a ship's capstan, raised or lowered big bundles. Here, he thought, was a business opportunity for him. Introduce the steam engine. It'd be the greatest thing that ever bit this planet. Wood-burning automobiles could replace the rickshaws. Cranes could be run by donkey engines. The ships themselves could have their wheels powered by steam. Or perhaps, he thought, rails could be laid across the exerdimer, and locomotives would make the ships obsolete. No, that wouldn't work. Iron rails cost too much, and the savages that roved over the grassy plains would tear them up and forge weapons from them. Besides, every time he suggested to the Duke a new and much more efficient method of doing something, he ran dead into the brick wall of tradition and custom. Nothing new could be accepted unless the gods accepted it. The gods' will was interpreted by the priests. The priests clutched the status quo as tightly as a hungry infant clutches its mother's breast, or an old man clings to his property. Green could make a fight against the theocracy, but he didn't feel it was worthwhile to become a martyr. He heard a familiar voice behind him calling his name. "Alan! Alan!" He hunched his shoulders like a turtle withdrawing his head, and thought desperately for a moment of trying to ignore the voice. But, though a woman's, it was powerful and penetrating, and everybody around him had already turned to see its owner, so he couldn't pretend he hadn't heard it. "Alan, you big, blond, no-good hunk of a man! Stop!" Reluctantly, Green told his rickshaw boy to turn around. The boy, grinning, did so. Like everybody else along the harbor front, he knew Amra and was familiar with her relations with Green. She held her 1-year-old daughter in her arms, cradled against her magnificent bosom. Behind her stood her other 5 children, her 2 sons by the Duke, her daughter by a visiting prince, her son by the captain of a northerner ship, her daughter by a temple sculptor. Her rise and fall and slow rise again was told in the children around her. The tableau embodied an outline of the structure of the planet's society. Her mother had been a northerner slave, her father a native freeman, a wheelwright. When she was 5 years old, they had died in a plague. She had been transferred to the pens and raised by her aunt. When she was 15, her beauty had attracted the Duke, and he had installed her in the palace. There she gave birth to his 2 sons, now 10 and 11, who would soon be taken away from her and raised in the Duke's household as free and petted servants. The Duke had married the present Duchess several years after his liaison with Amra began, and her jealousy had forced him to get rid of Amra. Back to the pen she had gone. Perhaps the Duke had not been too sad to see her go, for living with her was like living with a hurricane, and he liked peace and quiet too well. Then, in accordance with the custom, she had been recommended by the Duke to a visiting prince. The prince had overstayed his leave from his native country because he hated to part with her, and the Duke had wanted to give her as a present. But here he'd overstepped his legal authority. Slaves had certain rights. A woman who had borne a citizen a child could not be shipped away or sold unless she gave her permission. Amra didn't choose to go, so the sorrowing prince had gone home, though not without leaving a memento of his visit behind him. The captain of a ship had purchased her, but here again the law came to her rescue. He could not take her out of the country, and she again refused to leave. By now she had purchased several businesses. Slaves were allowed to hold property and even have slaves of their own, and she knew that her 2 boys by the Duke would be valuable later on, when they'd go to live with him. The temple sculptor had used her as his model for his great marble statue of the goddess of fertility. Well he might, for she was a magnificent creature, a tall woman with long, richly auburn hair, a flawless skin, large russet-brown eyes, a mouth as red and ripe as a plum, breasts with which neither child nor lover could find fault, a waist amazingly slender considering the rest of her curved body and her fruitfulness. Her long legs would have looked good on an Earthwoman, and were even more astounding among a population of club-ankled females. There was more to her than beauty. She radiated a something that struck every male at first sight. To Green she sometimes seemed to be a violent physical event, perhaps even a principle of nature herself. There were times when Green felt proud because she had picked him as her mate, chosen him when he was a newly imported slave, who could say only a few words in the highly irregular, agglutinative tongue. But there were times when he felt that she was too much for him, and those times had been getting too frequent lately. Besides, he felt a pang whenever he saw their child, because he loved it and dreaded the moment when he would have to leave it. As for deserting Amra, he wasn't sure how that would make him feel. Undeniably, she did affect him, but then so did a blow in the teeth or wine in the blood. He got down out of the rickshaw, told the boy to wait, said, "Hello, honey," and kissed her. He was glad she was a slave, because she didn't wear a nose ring. When he kissed the Duchess he was always annoyed by hers. She refused to take it off when with him, because that would put her on his level, and he mustn't ever forget he was a slave. It was perfectly moral for her to take a bondsman as a lover, but not a freeman, and she was nothing if not moral. Amra's return kiss was passionate, part of which was the vigor of asperity. "You're not fooling me," she said. "You meant to ride right by. Kiss the children. What's the matter? Are you getting tired of me? You told me you only accepted the Duchess's offer because it meant advancement, and you were afraid that if you turned her down she'd find an excuse to kill you. Well, I believed you, half believed you anyway. But I won't if you try sneaking by without seeing me. What's the matter? Are you a man or not? Are you afraid to face a woman? Don't shake your head. You're a liar. Don't forget to kiss Grizz Quetter. You know he's an affectionate boy and worships you, and it's absurd to say that in your country grown men don't kiss boys that old. You're not in your country. What a strange, frigid, loveless race must live there. And even if you were, you might overlook their customs to show some tenderness to the boy. Come back to our house, and I'll bring up some of that wonderful Chalusma wine that came in the other day out of the cellar." "What was a ship doing in your cellar?" he said, and whooped with laughter. "By all the gods, Amra, I know it's been 2 days since I've seen you, but don't try to crowd 48 hours conversation into 10 minutes, especially your kind of conversation. And quit scolding me in front of the children. You know it's bad for them. They might pick up your attitude of contempt for the head of the house." "I? Contempt? Why, I worship the ground you walk on. I tell them continually what a fine man you are, though it's rather hard to convince them when you do show up and they see the truth. Still—" There was only one way to handle her. That was to out-talk, out-shout, out-act her. It was hard going, especially when he felt so tired, and when she would not cooperate with him but would fight for precedence. The trouble was she didn't feel any respect for the man she could shut up, so it was absolutely necessary to dominate her. This he accomplished by giving her a big squeeze, causing the baby to cry because she was pushed in too tightly between the two of them. Then, while Amra was trying to soothe the baby, he began telling her what had happened at the palace. She was silent, except for a sharply pointed question interjected now and then, and she insisted upon hearing the details of everything that had taken place. Everything. He told her things that he would not have mentioned before children, 2 years ago, but the extremely frank and uninhibited society of slaves had freed him of any such restraints. They went inside Amra's house through her offices, where 6 of her clerks and secretaries worked, through the living rooms proper, and on into the kitchen. She rang a bell and told Inzax, a pretty little blonde, to go into the cellar and bring up a quart of Chalusma. One of the clerks popped his head in the kitchen door and told her that a Mr. Sheshyarventi, purser of an Andunanarga vessel, wanted to see her about the disposition of some rare birds that she had ordered 7 months before. He would deal with no one but her. "Let him cool his heels for a while," she said. The clerk gulped, and his head disappeared. Green took Paxi, his daughter, and played with her while Amra poured their wine. "This can go on only so long," she said. "I love you, and I'm not getting the attention I'm accustomed to. You should find some pretense to break off with the Duchess. I'm a vigorous woman who needs a lot of love. I want you here." Green had nothing to lose by agreeing with her, since he planned to be leaving in a very short time. "You're right," he said. "I'll tell her as soon as I think of a good excuse." He fingered his neck at the place where a headsman's axe would come down. It had better be a good one, though. Amra seemed to glow all over with happiness. She held her glass up and said, "Here's to the Duchess. May demons carry her off." "You'd better be careful saying that before the children. You know that if they innocently repeat that to someone, and it got back to the Duchess, you'd be burned at the next witch hunt." "Not my children," she scoffed. "They're too clever. They take after their mother. They know when to keep their mouths shut." Green gulped his wine and stood up. "I must go." "You'll come home tonight? Surely the Duchess will let you out 1 night a week." "Not 1 single night. And I can't come here this evening because I'm to meet Miran the merchant at the House of Equality. Business, you know." "Oh, I know. You'll dilly-dally about the whole matter and put off acting for one reason or another, and the first thing you know, years will go by and—" "If this keeps up, I'll be dead in 6 months," he said. "I'm tired. I have to get some sleep." She changed instantly from anger to sympathy. "Poor dear, why don't you forget that appointment and sleep here until time to go back to the castle? I'll send a messenger to Miran telling him you're sick." "No, this is something I just can't pass by." "What is it?" "It's of such a nature that telling you or anybody would spoil it." "And just what could that be?" she demanded, angry again. "It concerns some woman, I'll bet." "My problem is keeping away from you women, not getting into more trouble. No, it's just that Miran has sworn me by all his gods to keep silent, and of course I couldn't think of breaking a vow." "I know your opinion of our gods," she said. "Well, go along with you. But I warn you, I'm an impatient woman. I'll give you a week to work on the Duchess. Then I'm launching an attack myself." "That won't be necessary," he said. He kissed her and the children and left. He congratulated himself on having delayed Amra that long. If he couldn't carry out his scheme in a week, he was lost anyway. He'd have to walk away from the city and out onto the Exerdimer, even if packs of wild dogs and man-eating grass cats and cannibalistic men and God knew what else did roam the grassy plains. Chapters 4 through 6. Every city and village of the empire had its House of Equality, within whose walls distinctions of every type were abandoned. Green did not know the origin of the institution, but he recognized its value as a safety valve to blow off the extreme social pressure put on every class. Here the slave who did not dare open his mouth in the outside mundane world could curse his master to his face and go unpunished by the authorities. Of course, there was nothing to keep the master from retaliating in kind, for the slave also cast off his legal rights when he entered. Violence was not unknown here, though it was infrequent. Bloodshed within these walls did not, theoretically, call for punishment, but any murderer would find that, though the police paid no attention to him, he'd have to deal with the slain one's relatives. Many feuds had had their origin and end here. Green had excused himself after the evening meal, saying that he had to talk to Miran about getting some spices from Astoria. Also, the merchant had mentioned that on his last trip he'd heard that a band of Astorian hunters were going after the rare and beautiful Getzlen bird, and that he might find some for sale when he returned there. Zuni's face lit up. because she desired a Getchland bird even more than a chance to annoy her husband. Graciously, she gave Green permission to leave. Inwardly exultant, though outwardly pulling a long face that was supposed to suggest his sadness at having to leave the Duchess, he backed out of the dining room. Not very gracefully, for Alzo chose that moment to refuse to get out of Green's path. Green tumbled backward, sprawling over the huge mastiff, who snarled with anger and trembled with hypocritical indignation and bared his fangs with the intention of tearing Green apart. The Earthman did not try to rise, because he did not want to give Alzo an excuse for jumping him. Instead, he bared his own teeth and snarled back. The hall roared with laughter, and the Duke, holding his sides, tears running from his bulging eyes, rose and staggered over to where the two faced each other on all fours. He clutched Alzo's spike-studded collar and dragged him away, meanwhile choking out a command to Green to take off while the taking was good. Green swallowed his anger, thanked the Duke, and left. Swearing that he'd rip the hound apart some day with his bare hands, the Earthman left for the House of Equality. It took all the long rickshaw ride to the temple for him to calm down. The great central room with its 3-story ceiling was full that night. Men in their long evening kilts and women in masks crowded around the gambling tables, the bars, and the grudge stages. There was a large crowd around the platform in which 2 dealers in wheat were slugging it out to work off resentment arising from business disputes. But by far the greatest number had gathered to watch a husband and wife match. His left hand had been tied to his side, and she had been armed with a club. Thus equalized, they had been given the word to go at it. So far the man had had the worst of the match, as bloody patches on his head and bruises on his arm showed. If he could get the club away from her, he had the right to do what he wanted to her. But if she could break his free arm, she had him at her complete mercy. Green avoided the stage, because such barbarous doings made him sick. Looking for Moran, he finally found him rolling a pair of 6-sided dice with another captain. This fellow wore the red turban and black robes of the clan Oxacan. He had just lost to Moran and was paying him 60 equager, a goodly sum even for a merchant prince. Moran took Green's arm, something he'd never have done outside the house, and led him off to a curtained booth where they could get as much privacy as they wished. He matched Green for drinks. Green lost, and Moran ordered a large pitcher of Chalusma. "Nothing but the best for yours truly, whenever someone else is paying," Moran said jovially. "Now, I'm a great one for fun, but I'm here primarily for business. So, let's have your proposal at once, if you please." "First, I must have your solemn oath that you will tell absolutely no one what you heard in this booth. Second, that if you reject my idea, you do not then use it later on. Third, that if you do accept, you will never attempt later on to kill me or get rid of me and thus reap the profits." Moran's face had been blank, but at the word profits it twisted into many folds and creases, all expressions of joy. He reached into the huge purse he carried slung over his shoulder, and pulled out a little golden idol of the patron deity of the clan Ephenaiken. Putting his right hand upon its ugly head, he lifted his left and said, "I swear by Zephan Quanquaner that I will obey your wishes in this matter. May he strike me with lice, leprosy, lecher's disease, and lightning if I should break this, my solemn vow." Satisfied, Green said, "First, I want you to arrange for me to be aboard your windroller when you leave for Astoria." Moran choked on his wine and coughed and sputtered until Green pounded his back. "I do not ask that you give me passage back. Now, here's my idea. You plan to be taking a large cargo of dried fish because the Astorians' religion requires that they eat them at every meal, and because they use them in great quantities at their numerous festivals." "True, true. Do you know, I've never been able to figure out why they should worship a fish goddess.
They live over 5,000 miles from the sea, and there's no evidence that any of them have ever been to the sea. Yet they demand saltwater fish, won't use the fish from a nearby lake.
There are many mysteries about the Exerdimer. However, they needn't concern us. Now, do you know that the historian's Book of Gods places much more ritual power in freshly killed and cooked fish than in smoked fish? However, they've always had to be content with the dried fish the windrollers brought them. What price would they not pay for living sea fish? Moran rubbed his palms together.
Indeed, it makes one wonder.
Green then outlined his idea. Moran sat stunned, not at the audacity or originality of the plan, but because it was so obvious that he wondered why neither he nor anyone else had ever thought of it. He said so. Green drank his wine and said, "I suppose that people wondered the same when the first wheel or bow or arrow was invented. So obvious, yet no one thought of them until then."
"Let me get this straight," said Moran. "You want me to buy a caravan of wagons, build watertight tanks into them, and use them to transport ocean fish back to here? Then the wagon bodies, with their contents, will be lifted up onto my windroller and fitted into specially prepared racks, or perhaps holes, on the middeck? Also, you will show me how to analyze seawater so that its formula may be sold to the Astorians, and they can thus keep the fish alive in their own tanks."
"That's right." Moran ran his fat, ring-studded finger over his hooked nose and the square gold ornament hanging therefrom. His single eye glared pale bluely at Green. The other was covered with a white patch to hide the emptiness left after a ball from a Ving musket had struck it.
"It's 4 weeks until the very last day in which I can set sail from here and still get to Astoria and back before the rains come. It's barely possible to have the tanks built, get them convoyed down to the seashore, get the fish in, and bring them back. Meantime, I can have the deck altered. If my men work day and night, we can make it."
Of course, this is a one-shot proposition. You can't possibly keep a monopoly on the idea once the first trip is over. Too many people are bound to talk, and the other captains will hear of it.
"I know. Don't teach an Ephenaican to suck eggs. But what if the fish should die?"
Green shrugged and spread out his palms. "A possibility. You're taking a tremendous gamble. But every voyage on the Exerdimer is, isn't it? How many windrollers come back? Or how many can boast your list of 40 successful trips?"
"Not many," said Moran.
He slumped in his seat, brooding over his goblet of wine. His eye, sunk in ranges of fat, seemed to stare through Green. The Earthman pretended indifference, though his heart was pounding, and he controlled his breathing with difficulty.
"You're asking a great deal," Moran finally said. "If the Duke were to find out that I'd agreed to help a valued slave escape, I'd be tortured in a most refined way, and the clan Ephenaican would be stripped of all of its rights to sail windrollers and would probably be exiled to its native hills, or else would have to take to piracy, and that, despite all the glamorous stories you hear, is not a very well-paying profession."
"You'd make a killing in Astoria."
"True. But when I think of what the Duchess will do when she discovers you've fled the country, ow, ow, ow."
"There's no reason why you should be connected with my disappearance. A dozen craft leave the harbor every day. Besides, for all she'll know, I've gone the opposite way, over the hills and to the ocean, or to the hills themselves, where many runaway slaves are."
"Yes, but I have to return to Tropat, and my clansmen, though notoriously tight-lipped when sober, are also, I must confess, notorious drunkards. Someone would be sure to babble in the taverns."
"I'll dye my hair black, like a Tzatlam tribesman, and sign on."
"You forget that you have to belong to my clan in order to be a crew member."
Well, what about this adoption by blood routine?"
"What about it?
I can't propose that unless you've done something spectacular and for the profit of the clan. Wait, can you play any musical instrument? Promptly, Green lied. Oh, I'm a wonderful harpist. When I play, I can soothe a hungry grass cat into lying down at my feet and licking my toes with pure affection. Excellent, though it would not be an affection so pure, since it is well known that the grass cat considers a man's toes a great delicacy, and always eats them first, even before the eyes. Listen well. Here's what you must do in 4 weeks' time, for if all goes well, or all goes ill, we set sail on the week of the oak, the day of the sky, the hour of the lark, a most propitious time. To Green, the next 3 weeks seemed to have shifted into low gear, they crept by so slowly. Yet they should have raced by quickly enough, so full of schemes and plots were they. He had to advise Moran on the many technical details involved in building tanks for the fish. He had to keep the Duchess happy, an increasingly difficult job, because it was impossible to pretend a 100% absorption in her, while his mind desperately looked for flaws in his plans, found so many, and then as anxiously sought ways of repairing them. Nevertheless, he knew it was vital that he not displease or bore her. Prison would forever ruin his chances. Worst of all, Amra was getting suspicious. "You are trying to conceal something from me," she told Green. "You ought to know better. I can tell when a man is deceiving me. There's something about the voice, the eyes, the way he makes love, though you've been doing very little of that. What are you plotting?" "I assure you it's simply that I'm very tired," he said sharply. "All I want is some peace and quiet, a little rest, and a little privacy now and then." "Don't try to tell me that's all." She cocked her head to one side and squinted at him, managing somehow even in this grotesque attitude to look ravishingly beautiful. Suddenly she said, "You wouldn't be thinking of running away, would you?" For a second he became pale. Damn the woman anyway. "Don't be ridiculous," he said, trying hard to keep his voice from cracking. "I'm too much aware of the penalties if I were caught. Besides, why should I want to run away? You are the most desirable woman I've ever known." This was the truth. "Though you're not the easiest one in the world to live with." A master understatement. "I would have gotten no place without you." True, but he couldn't spend the rest of his life on this barbarous world. "And it is unthinkable that I would want to leave you." Inexpressible, yes, but not unthinkable. He couldn't take her with him for the simple reason that even if she would go, she would never fit in his life on earth. She'd be absolutely unhappy. Moreover, she'd not go anyway, because she'd refuse to abandon her children and would try to take them along, thus wrecking all his escape plans. He might as well hire a brass band and march behind it out of the city and onto the windroller in the light of high noon. Nevertheless, his conscience troubled him. If it was painful to leave Amra, it was hell to leave Paxi, his daughter. For days he had considered taking her along with him, but eventually abandoned the idea. Trying to steal her from under Amra's fiercely watchful gaze was almost impossible. Moreover, Paxi would miss her mother terribly, and he had no business exposing the baby to the risks of the voyage, which were many. Amra would doubly be hurt. Losing him would be bad enough, but to lose Paxi also? No, he couldn't do that to her. The outcome of this conversation with her was that she apparently dropped her suspicions. At least she never spoke of them again. He was glad of that, for it was impossible to keep entirely hidden his connection with the mysterious actions of Moran the merchant. The whole city knew something was up. There was undoubtedly a lot of money tied up in this deal of the wagon caravan going to the seashore. But what did it all mean? Neither Moran nor Green would say a word, and while the Duke and Duchess might have used their authority to get the information from their slave, the Duke made no move. Moran had promised to let him in on a share of the profits, provided he gave the merchant a free hand and asked no questions. The Duke was quite content. He planned on spending the money to increase his collection of glass birds. He had 10 large rooms of the castle glittering with his fantastic aviary, shining, silent, and grotesquely beautiful, all products of the glass blowers of the fabulous city of Metzvamush, far, far away across the grassy sea of the Exerdemer. Green was present when the Duke talked to Moran about it.
"Now, Captain, you must understand just exactly what I do want," warned the ruler, lifting a finger to emphasize the seriousness of his words. His eyes, usually deep sunk in their fat, had widened to reveal large, brown, and soulful orbs. The passion for his hobby shone forth. Nothing, good Chalusma wine, his wife, the torture of a heretic or runaway slave, could make him quiver and glitter with delight as much as the thought of the exquisitely wrought image of a Metzvamush bird. "I want 2 or 3, but no more, because I can't afford more. All made by Eisen Yushwa, the greatest of the glass-blowers. I'd particularly like any modeled after the Bird of Terror."
"But when I was last in Astoria, I heard that Eisen Yushwa was dying," said Moran.
"Excellent, excellent!" cried the Duke. "That will make everything recently created by him even more valuable. If he is dead now, it is probable that the Astorians, who control the export of the Mushans, will be putting a high price on anything of his that comes their way. That means that bidding will be high during the festival, and that you must outbid any prospective buyers. By all means do so. Pay any price, for I must have something created by him in his last days."
The Duke, Green realized, was so eager because of the belief that a part of a dying artist's soul entered into his latest creations when he died. These were called soul works, and brought 10 times as much as anything else, even if the conception and execution were inferior to previous works. Sourly, Moran said, "But you've given me no money to buy your birds."
"Of course not. You will lend me the sum, buy them yourself, and when you come back with them, I will raise the money to repay you."
Moran didn't seem too happy, but Green knew that the fat merchant was already planning to charge the Duke double the purchase price. As for Green, he liked to see a man interested in a hobby, but he was disgusted because taxes would now be raised in order to allow the Duke to add to his collection. The Duchess, bored as usual by her husband's conversation, suddenly said, "Honey, let's go hunting next weekend. I've been so restless lately, so unable to sleep nights. I think I've been cooped up too long in this dismal old place. My digestion has been so sluggish lately. I think I need the exercise and the fresh air." And she went on into vivid detail about certain aspects of her gastrointestinal troubles. The Earthman, who thought he was hardened to this people's custom of dwelling on such matters, turned green. At the suggestion of a hunt, the Duke didn't exactly groan, but his eyes rolled upward in supplication to the gods. Until he had reached the age of 30, he had enjoyed a good hunt. But, like most upper-class men of his culture, he rapidly put on flesh after 30 and became as sedentary as possible. The belief was that fat increased a man's lifespan. Also, a big belly and double chin were signs of aristocratic blood and a full purse. Unfortunately, along with this came an inevitable decline in vigor, which, coupled with the December-May marriages that their society expected of them, had given birth to another institution, the slave-male companion of the rich man's young wife. It was toward Green that the Duke looked. "Why not let him conduct the hunt?" he suggested hopefully. "I've so much business to take care of." "Like sitting on your fat cushion and contemplating your glass birds?" she said. "No." "Very well," he said resignedly.
I've a slave in the work-pens who's to be executed for striking a foreman. We'll use him as the quarry, but I think we ought to give him 2 weeks to build up his wind and legs. Otherwise it would hardly be sporting, you know."
The Duchess frowned.
"No, I'm getting bored. I can't stand this inaction any longer."
She shot a glance at Green. He felt his stomach muscles contracting. Evidently she'd noticed his lukewarm interest in her. This hunt was partly to suggest to him that he'd be meeting a like fate unless he perked up and began to be more entertaining. It wasn't that made his heart sink. It was that next weekend was when Moran's windroller raised sail and when he planned to be aboard it. Now he'd be gone conducting the hunting party up in the hills. Green looked appealingly at Moran, but the merchant's shoulders rose beneath the yellow robe as if to say, "What can I do?" He was right. Moran couldn't suggest that he too go along on the hunt, and thus give Green a chance to slip aboard afterward. The day on which the Bird of Fortune was scheduled to leave the windbreak was absolutely the last day on which it could set sail. He couldn't afford to take the chance of being caught in the rains in the middle of the vast plains. All the next day Green was too busy setting up the schedule of the hunting party to have time to be gloomy, but when night came he seemed to fold up inside himself. Could he pretend to be sick, too, and be left behind when the party set out? No, for they would at once assume that he had been possessed by a demon and would pack him off to the temple of Apakwas, god of healing. There he'd be under lock and key until he proved himself healthy. The terrible part about going to the temple of Apakwas was that it made death almost inevitable. If you didn't die of your own disease, you caught somebody else's. Green wasn't worried about catching any of the many diseases he'd be exposed to in the temple. Like all men of terrestrial descent, he carried in his body a surgically implanted protoplasmic entity which automatically analyzed any invading microscopic organisms and/or viruses and manufactured antibodies to combat them. It lived in the space created by the removal of his appendix. When working to fulfill its mission, it demanded food and radiated a heat that assured its host of its heartening presence. An increased appetite, plus a slight fever, indicated that it was killing off the disease, and that within several hours it would successfully repel any boarders. In the 2 years Green had been on the planet, it had had to attack at least 40 times. Green calculated that he would have been dead each and every time if it had not been for his symbiote. Knowing this didn't help him. If he played sick, he'd be locked up and couldn't get on the roller. If he went on the hunting party, he missed the boat too. Suppose he were to disappear the night before the party, to hide on the windroller while the castle vainly looked for him. Not very likely. The first thing that would occur to Zuni would be to order the windbreak closed and all rollers searched for a possible stowaway. And if that happened, Moran would be so delayed that it was unlikely he'd sail. Even if he, Green, hid in Moran's cabin, where he would probably be safe, there would still be the inevitable and totally frustrating delay. Then why not disappear several days earlier, so that Moran could have time to reload his cargo? He'd see the merchant tomorrow. If Moran fell in with his plans, Green would disappear 4 nights from this very night, which would leave 3 days for the windroller to be emptied and reloaded. Fortunately, the tanks wouldn't have to be taken off, because any fool could see that the runaway wasn't hiding at the bottom among the fish. Much relieved that he at least had a way open, if a very perilous one, Green relaxed. He was sitting on a bench along a walk on top of one of the castle walls. The sky was blazingly beautiful, with stars larger than any seen from Earth. The great moon and the small moon had risen. The larger had just cleared the eastern horizon, and the lesser one was just past the zenith. Mingled moonwash and star-wash softened the grimness and ugliness of the city below him, and laved it in a flood of romance and glamour. Most of Quats was unlighted, for the streets had no lamps, and the windows were shut up tight against thieves, vampires, and demons. Occasionally, the torch flares of the servants of a drunken noble or rich man moved down the dark canyons between the towering, overhanging houses. Beyond the city was the amphitheater formed by the hills curving out to the north, and the great brick wall built to continue the natural windbreak. A wide opening had been left so that the rollers, their sails furled, could be towed in or out. Past this the great plain suddenly began, as if the hand of some immense landscaper had pressed the hills flat, and declared that from here on there would be no unevenness. Westward lay the incredibly level stretch of the grassy ground of the Exerdemer. 10,000 miles straight across, flat as a tabletop, broken only here and there by clumps of forests, ruins of cities, water-holes, the tents of the nomadic savages, herds of wild animals, packs of grass cats and dire dogs, and the mysterious and undoubtedly imaginary roaming islands, great clumps of rock and dirt that legend said slid of their own volition over the plains. How like this planet, he thought, that the greatest peril to navigation should be one that existed only in the heads of the inhabitants. The Exerdemer was a fabulous phenomenon, without parallel. On none of the many planets that Earthmen had discovered was there anything similar. How, he wondered, could the plain keep its smoothness, when there was always dirt running onto it from the eroding hills and the mountains that ringed it? The rains, too, should have done much to wear it away unevenly. Of course, the grass that grew all over it was long and had very tough roots. And if what he had been told was true, beneath the vegetation was one mass of inextricably tangled roots that held the soil together. There was another thing to consider, though, the winds that blew all the way across the Exerdemer and furnished propulsion for the wheeled sailing craft. To have winds, you must have pressure differentials, which were usually caused by heat differentials. Although the Exerdemer was ringed by mountains, there were no large eminences on it for 10,000 miles, nothing to replenish the currents of air. Or so it seemed to his limited knowledge of meteorology, though he did wonder how the trade winds that swept Earth's seas managed to keep going for so many thousands of leagues, just on their original impetus. Or did they get boosts? He didn't know. What he did know was that the Exerdemer was a thing that shouldn't be. Yet the very presence of men here was just as amazing, just as preposterous. Homo sapiens was scattered throughout the galaxy. Everywhere that the space-traveling Earthmen had gone, they had found that about every fourth inhabitable planet was populated by men of their species. The proof lay not just in the outward physical resemblance of terrestrial and extraterrestrial, it lay in their ability to breed. Earthman, Syrian, Alberian, vegan, it made no difference. Their men could have children by the women of other planets. Naturally, there had been many theories to account for this fact. All had as a common basis the assumption that Homo sapiens had sometime, somewhere, in the very remote past, originated on one planet and then had spread out over the galaxy from it. And somehow space travel had been lost, and each race had gone back to savagery, only to begin again the long, hard struggle toward civilization and the rediscovery of spaceships. Why, no one knew. One could only guess. There was the problem of language. It might seem that if man had come from a common birthplace, he would have at least kept a trace of his home language, and the linguists could break down the development of tongue and link one planet to another through it. But no. Every world had its own Tower of Babel, its own 10,000 languages. The terrestrial scientist might trace Russian and English and Swedish and Lithuanian and Persian and Hindustani back to a Proto-Indo-European, but he had never found on any other planet a language which he could say had also derived from the Aryan Ursprach. Green's mind wandered to the two Earthmen now imprisoned in the city of Astoria. He hoped they weren't being treated badly. They could be in horrible pain at this very moment, if the priests felt like subjecting them to a little demon testing. Thinking of torture led him to sit up a little straighter and to stretch his arms and legs. In an hour he was supposed to meet the Duchess. To do that, he had to go through the supposedly secret door in the wall of the turret at the northern end of the walk, up a stairway through a passage between the walls, and so to the Duchess's apartments. There one of the maids of honor would usher him into Zuni's presence, and then would try to eavesdrop so she could report to the Duke later on. Zuni and Green weren't supposed to know about this, but were to pretend that she was their trusted confidant. When the great bell of the Temple of the God of Time, Gruza, struck, Green would rise from his bench and go to what he now thought of as a wearisome chore. If that woman could only be interested in talking of something else besides her complexion or digestion, or idle palace gossip, it wouldn't be so bad. But no, she chattered on, and Green would get increasingly sleepy, yet would not dare drop off for fear of irreparably offending her, and to do that